Peter Minuit is a really interesting guy. He's a businessman, self-made, who ends up conducting the most famous real estate transaction in the history of the world.
In the 17th century, Sweden is having its golden age, and the Swedes decide they too want to have a new world colony.
The Swedes were a mighty military and a growing naval power in the Baltic, and they were looking to branch out.
When a group of entrepreneurs proposed the idea of establishing a Swedish colony in North America, that idea found favor with the government.
Sweden's interest in founding the colony in North America would be finding its position amongst other successful nations of Europe.
They wanted to make sure that they were in the race for trade in the New World.
The new Sweden company formed and defined one of its main trading objectives.
The fur of beavers was very fashionable in Europe at the time.
Beaver hats were all the rage.
Almost all of the beavers were extinct all over Europe, so they were desperately seeking for new markets.
That was a main reason for the settlement, to get beaver pelts from which they would make felt hats.
But the expedition would need a leader who knew his way around the New World, specifically New Netherland.
That explains why they needed Peter Minuit.
Minuit is a very shadowy figure. In terms of his own background, you had Dutch, French, and German in the mix. He skirted these boundaries and moved back and forth comfortably.
Even his name, Minuit, is interesting. It translates into midnight. He would be Commander Midnight.
He was very familiar with the Delaware Valley as he had explored it himself under the Dutch.
One of the most persistent stories in American history is the, quote, purchase of the island of Manhattan from the natives for $24. Minuit is the guy who does this. He was a kind of proto-capitalist, he was a free trader, he was an adventurer. Obviously, he is someone who impressed with his abilities to lead and his sense of what to do. He had been all over the territory claimed by the Dutch in North America. He knew it intimately. And he knows what the Dutch called the South River, which we call the Delaware River, was perennially undermanned.
Peter Minuit knew exactly where he wanted to establish New Sweden, and he knew precisely what trading items to bring on the transatlantic journey.
Because of his experience, Minuit was very knowledgeable about what would appeal to the Native Americans.
This is the critical piece to the whole expedition. Glass beads are taken for granted if you live with them, but if you are not used to this kind of ornamentation, it's pretty special. Iron and pewterware were also an important trade good.
One of the goods that the Swedes had to offer that was new to the area was copper. The Native Americans, what they would do is break them down, cut them up, and use them as sharp arrow points.
Duffel cloth. The KALMAR nickel carried 1.5 miles of bright red duffel cloth.
The Lenape were still relying on clay vessels and stone axes. So they were a little bit in awe of these people that were coming with these metal blades and these iron pots and all of these modern conveniences.
Minuit knew that it was about the relationships he could develop with the natives.
Minuit was very familiar with the waterways and how the Native Americans used them for trade. So he knew where to go in order to call the leaders of the Lenape tribe over to negotiate for land.
The Swedes weren't trying to displace the Native Americans. They weren't taking over the land. They were interspersed on the land with the Native Americans.
They had agreed to share this property and share its resources.
It was the strong bond Peter Minuit established with the Native Americans that paved the way for commercial enterprise right here in the Delaware Valley.
Minuit speaks to the capitalism and the entrepreneurial aspect that America was always about, doing well by doing good.
In terms of what this colony brought ultimately to American society, to the future United States, it was a success in that it brought a nest of ideas that contributed to what America became.